In 2014, scientists studying Jewish genomes uncovered a demographic clue pointing toward a surprisingly small ancestral population centuries ago. The discovery did not reveal mysterious DNA, but something more realistic: thousands of modern people sharing segments inherited from common ancestors. For most families, distant ancestry becomes difficult to trace once records disappear, borders change, and generations move across different countries. DNA can sometimes recover part of that missing history because chromosomes preserve biological connections long after written names are forgotten. This became especially important when researchers examined Ashkenazi Jewish genomes and noticed unusually long stretches of shared DNA. Those shared stretches suggested that many people descended from a relatively small group of ancestors who lived several centuries earlier. The finding challenged the simple idea that modern populations always grow steadily without major periods of decline. Instead, genetic evidence suggested a severe population bottleneck followed by rapid expansion across later generations. A bottleneck does not mean every person lived together or that historians can identify an exact medieval census. It means the number of people effectively contributing genes to future generations became much smaller than the surrounding population. That difference is crucial because random inheritance can cause some genetic variants to disappear while others become unexpectedly common. The effect can remain visible today, even when descendants have no knowledge of their distant biological connections. Imagine meeting someone from another country and discovering that your DNA contains a small genetic segment inherited from shared medieval ancestors. That connection would not reveal their name, occupation, or exact hometown, but it could reveal that your family histories once intersected. Researchers found patterns like this repeatedly, turning modern genomes into evidence for population movements that written history could only partly describe. But the numbers raised a harder question. Why did this particular population experience such a dramatic reduction in genetic diversity? Historical records show that Jewish communities in medieval Europe faced migration, persecution, expulsions, disease, and changing political conditions. Yet no single event has been proven to explain the entire genetic bottleneck, and scientists remain careful about separating evidence from speculation. Somewhere between these historical pressures and later population growth, a remarkable genetic story unfolded, and the next clue lies in medieval Europe. Jewish communities had lived across the Mediterranean and Middle East for centuries before Ashkenazi communities emerged in medieval Europe. Ancient migrations followed wars, trade routes, exile, and political changes, carrying families between cities and distant regions. By the early medieval period, Jewish settlements existed across parts of France, Germany, Italy, and other European territories. These communities were usually small, connected through religion, trade, family relationships, and shared cultural traditions. Life was rarely stable because rulers changed, local laws differed, and communities sometimes faced restrictions or forced movement. Historical records describe expulsions from several European regions, including England, France, and later territories within the German-speaking world. Some families moved eastward, finding new opportunities in Central and Eastern Europe as political conditions gradually changed. Over generations, larger Jewish communities developed in areas that later became parts of Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus. The movement was not one giant migration, but a long process involving many smaller journeys across generations. Families traveled between towns, followed trade networks, and sometimes relocated because authorities changed local rules or imposed restrictions. This matters because isolated communities can experience major genetic changes when relatively few people establish new settlements. Marriage patterns also mattered, because religious traditions often encouraged marriage within the community, limiting outside genetic mixing. Such social patterns did not completely prevent intermarriage, but they could increase the influence of particular ancestors. Medieval towns also experienced repeated crises, including famine, epidemic disease, violence, and economic disruption that affected entire populations. The Black Death brought enormous mortality across Europe during the 14th century, although its exact demographic impact differed between communities. Jewish communities were sometimes falsely blamed for the plague, leading to violence, expulsions, and further population displacement. These events created fragmented settlement patterns, with survivors moving between regions and rebuilding communities under difficult circumstances. Yet historians cannot simply connect every persecution event to the genetic bottleneck, because the evidence does not support one direct cause. Genetic studies instead suggest that several generations of limited population size probably contributed to the distinctive Ashkenazi genetic pattern. The historical trail therefore leads toward a difficult question. How could scattered medieval communities leave such a powerful genetic signature today? Modern genetic research begins with blood samples, saliva tubes, laboratory machines, and thousands of carefully selected DNA sequences. Researchers compare genomes from different people worldwide, searching for shared segments that can reveal relatively recent common ancestors. In Ashkenazi Jewish populations, scientists found unusually long shared DNA segments appearing across many apparently unrelated families today. Longer shared segments usually indicate more recent common ancestry, because recombination gradually breaks inherited DNA into smaller pieces. This pattern suggested that many present-day Ashkenazi individuals inherited DNA from a limited number of ancestors several centuries ago. Researchers then used mathematical population models to estimate how small that ancestral population may have become over time. One influential study estimated an effective population size of roughly 250 to 420 people during a severe bottleneck. That number does not mean only 250 people physically existed, because effective population size has a specific genetic meaning. It describes how many ancestors effectively contributed genes to later generations, rather than providing a literal historical headcount. The distinction matters because medieval records were incomplete, inconsistent, and rarely capable of counting entire populations accurately, reliably. Genetic models suggested the bottleneck occurred roughly 25 to 32 generations ago, followed by rapid population growth afterward. That timing broadly fits a period when Ashkenazi communities were expanding across parts of Central and Eastern Europe. As populations expanded, inherited genetic variants from the bottleneck became more common and easier for scientists to detect. Some variants were harmless, while others included rare disease-associated mutations that became unusually frequent through founder effects over generations. This helps explain why several inherited disorders occur at elevated frequencies among people with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry today. Scientists emphasize that these conditions are genetic patterns, not evidence of superiority, weakness, or biological separation from other populations. Modern testing can identify certain variants, but ancestry alone cannot determine whether someone carries a particular genetic mutation personally. Researchers also continue comparing Jewish populations with European and Middle Eastern reference populations to reconstruct deeper ancestry. The result is not one perfect family tree, but a changing scientific picture built from genetics, history, archaeology, and statistics. The mystery was never one magical Jewish DNA marker, but a population bottleneck preserved through ordinary human inheritance. Genetic evidence suggests a small effective ancestral population survived demographic pressures before expanding rapidly across later generations. That expansion carried surviving genetic patterns into communities that eventually grew across Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and surrounding regions. Today, those patterns remain visible inside genomes, offering scientists clues about ancestors who left few written records behind. The bottleneck also helps explain why certain inherited disorders became more frequent through founder effects within Ashkenazi communities. But genetics cannot identify every historical event responsible, and scientists continue testing different demographic models against new evidence. This uncertainty is important because DNA can reveal population history without revealing the personal stories behind those genetic patterns. A chromosome cannot describe a medieval journey, a lost home, a family argument, or the fear surrounding persecution. Those details survive through historical documents, archaeology, oral traditions, and memories passed between generations. When these sources are combined, the picture becomes much richer than genetics alone could ever provide. The story shows how populations can shrink dramatically, then rebuild while carrying traces of their difficult past. It also demonstrates that ancestry is rarely simple, because modern populations contain layers created by migration and mixture. Ashkenazi Jewish history reflects Middle Eastern origins, European ancestry, medieval movement, community continuity, and later demographic expansion. Scientists continue refining these conclusions as larger datasets and improved statistical methods provide clearer evidence about ancient population changes. What once seemed like an invisible chapter of history can now be approached through measurable patterns inside human DNA. Yet the genome does not replace history. Instead, it adds another source of evidence to an already complicated human story. A bottleneck measured in genetic statistics ultimately represents real families whose descendants survived, moved, married, and built communities. Their biological legacy traveled quietly through centuries, long before anyone understood chromosomes, mutations, recombination, or population genetics. And that may be the most powerful discovery. Sometimes history disappears from documents, but survival remains written inside us.